Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Tea Leaves podcast, where we bring Asia to you through the conversations with the people whose lives and work are shaping the Indo-Pacific region.
One of my purposes in writing this book is to hold on to my heritage and tell myself I must not forget the lessons of the past and the experiences that my family members have had to go through. And not just my family members, but also, the people of Vietnam, the ancestors whom I didn't have the chance to meet.
I'm Rexon Yu, president of the Asia Group. For our episode today, I am excited and pleased to welcome a distinguished writer in both Vietnamese and English, Dr. Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai. She is a Vietnamese author and a poet whose international bestseller, The Mountains Sing, was the winner of multiple accolades: the 2020 Book Browse Best Debut Award, the 2021 International Book Awards, the 2021 PEN Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award, and the 2020 Lannan Literary Award Fellowship for Fiction. And I'm really looking forward to talking about it with you a bit today, Quế Mai. It's an incredible book. I have enjoyed it. My daughter has enjoyed it. And it is her latest in her library of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. Quế Mai, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you again for joining us on Tea Leaves.
Thank you so much, Rexon, for having me. Wow, it's amazing to hear that both you and your daughter read my novel. it's like this novel, I'm just very surprised that it's shared widely by family members. And actually, a lot of family members have told me that they read the book together and reflected on their family histories, after reading the book. So that's a blessing.
Yeah. I'll tell you, my daughter stole the book actually from me over the Christmas holiday, and she finished it before I was able to finish it. And I would say, look, on a personal note, part of what I think has resonated for us is that, my heritage is Korean and American, and both of my daughters, as they grow up here in the United States, have been exposed to my heritage. And I think the resonance of Vietnam and the period that you wrote about, which had contained, sorrow and tragedies, as you write, I think, resonates with families and with individuals that have, multiple heritages and ethnicities in their background.
Yeah, and I think, I'm sure your family coming from Korea, have also witnessed a lot of historical events which traumatized them and also brought a lot of emotions to you when you can reflect back on the history of your family members, right? And I think, one of my purposes in writing this book is to hold on to my heritage and tell myself I must not forget the lessons of the past and the experiences that my family members have had to go through. And not just my family members, but also, the people of Vietnam, the ancestors whom I didn't have the chance to meet. So this book, The Mountains Sing, took me 7 years to write, and it was a very emotional journey. And I feel like writing the book, I kind of approach healing. I haven't reached it yet because, there are issues which are still very painful to deal with. But I think being able to discuss about trauma, with a community of readers, you communalize it, so that you can also talk about healing for yourself and healing for others.
So, the book follows a family through several generations: grandmother, her children, and their children. So it spans multiple decades, and the trajectory of events, right, in Vietnam and what happened, going back to almost the 50s, right?
Yes, to the 30s.
30s.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all the way through, I think you end in the 1980s. So it's such a consequential period for Vietnam and what the country has gone through. How did you choose to write this book in English, Quế Mai?
So, I started my writing journey as a poet in Vietnamese.
Yes.
And then when I started to read in English, I could see so few stories from Vietnam, and
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam in literature in English normally, presents my homeland as the war, and Vietnamese people as the background to the Western stories. And I got frustrated and I wanted to, because Vietnam is a country with more than 4,000 years of history. And our literary traditions are very rich and colorful. And I told myself, okay, I need to present some of that beauty and complexity to the Western, to the international readers. So I spent years translating poetry as a volunteer. I did not earn a cent of money from it, but I did it. I was having my full-time job and spending my evenings, weekends translating poetry and having it published overseas. And I could see that, very few people read poetry. And so I told myself, okay, I have to translate a novel. So for years, I was looking for the right novel to translate. And then one day I told myself, why don't I write that novel myself? So that began the journey. But, I only had the chance to learn English when I was in the eighth grade because I grew up in the countryside of Vietnam and my school did not have any English teacher. So my brother was the first person who taught me some English words. And then I was lucky enough to go to a private class of a teacher who taught English to poor children in my hometown. So then I studied mostly by myself. So when it came to English, when I started writing, I began writing in English. I wasn't fluent at all. I had to learn a lot. And until today, I have to learn by reading, by taking notes, by paying close attention. Yeah, but I think it's I love learning and I love challenging myself. And I wanted to write in English to insert a voice from Vietnam into
Yes.
the canon of literature in English about Vietnam and present Vietnam as a country rather than a war. And I also want to, write back to the Western gaze on Vietnamese women. Because, if you watch a lot of Hollywood movies about Vietnam or a lot of Western literature about Vietnam have have represented Vietnamese women as those, who are victims, who are absent of agency, absent of trauma, and who need men to rescue them, So I wanted to write Vietnamese women as those I have met in my life, women
Mm-hmm.
who have inspired me. So, I have a new book, Dust Child, which is coming out in March 2000 in March this year. So in less
This
than
year. Right. Right.
in less than a month, the time is going so fast. So I'm like, am I still in 2022? No, but it will be coming out in less than a month. And I have two Vietnamese women who are the main characters in this book, and they are both bar girls, and they had to work in brothels to serve American soldiers. And before I researched on this book, I didn't know that hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese women had to work in the sex industry to serve American soldiers, and many of them remain traumatized until today. And I wanted to because this book is like the contradiction of Miss Saigon, where
Mm-hmm.
Kim in Miss
Mm-hmm.
Saigon, who's a bad girl who needed an American soldier to rescue her, and she would
Mm-hmm.
rather die than being stuck in Vietnam and being Vietnamese. And in this novel, which is a result of my research and my interviews with women who had to do these jobs, I found that they are such complex characters, and they're so compassionate, and they still have to live with terrible secrets that they have to bury so deep within themselves. And I found such strong connections with them that when I wrote this book, I really cried a lot, especially when
Wow.
they
Yeah.
they had to face the decisions, for example, to abandon their kids, because many of them became really young mothers and couldn't raise their kids, so they had to give away their kids. And as a mom, as a mother myself, I reflect on that decision and could imagine how difficult it was for them. And like when I was researching on books written by the mixed children or Amerasians, children of American soldier and Vietnamese women, the books that wrote about them in fiction normally, like talk about these women giving up the kids so easily and not being traumatized. And I said, this is not right. I mean, any mother to give the kids away, would be one of the hardest decisions. And like my real life conversations with these women are just so heartbreaking. Like for example, this book is actually inspired by my real life work as a journalist to help people find each other. And in 2015, I interviewed, like 8 American soldiers who had been going back to Vietnam to look for the children and the women they once abandoned. And then because they came to Vietnam as soldiers, so they were really young when they had Vietnamese girlfriends, and those girlfriends got pregnant. And these American soldiers, they were very afraid, so they walked away. So I interviewed them and I told one of them, why don't you write a letter to the woman you are looking for? And why don't you explain why you abandoned her in the first place when she was pregnant, and why after more than 40 years you are back in Vietnam looking
Yes.
for her?
Yes.
And then he wrote a letter, and you can imagine I write so much translating it, and I published on the national newspaper of Vietnam. And like then suddenly I got an email from this woman who told me, this is my first time writing an email. I had to go to the internet cafe to tell people to set up the email address. And then she said, can you call me? And she's the one in the letter.
Wow.
And then she told me that, after giving birth to her daughter, as a result of the relationship with the American soldier, she had to give the child away. And she said she had to give the child away to an orphanage. And until today, she has so much regret and sorrow. And she has done DNA testing and she hasn't found the
Mm-hmm.
child. And and there is so much heartbreak. I mean, if you search the internet, Amerasians looking for their parents, you will see
Yes.
many heartbreaking stories.
Yes.
And most people don't know that there were nearly 100,000 mixed children
Yes.
born into relationships between American soldiers and Vietnamese women, and most of them haven't found their parents.
Yes. No, it's such an emotional topic.
It is. I mean, and like most of these Amerasian people, they are about my age, and
Yes.
a lot of them are illiterate because they didn't have the chance to go to school. Because when they were abandoned in Vietnam and after the war, people look at them as children of the enemy. So they suffered a lot of discrimination. So terrible, and
Mm-hmm.
even their children don't have equal access to opportunities, to or job opportunities, to education opportunities these days. So the trauma that they inherit is passed
It
on from.
persists till today.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, Mike, can I ask you, when I was reading The Mountains Sing, I was struck in part by the connection that comes through in your writing between the characters and the environment, nature, and the landscape in Vietnam. Why is that? Can you talk a little bit about this connection from your perspective as a Vietnamese? Because it just, to me, it comes through so vividly
Mm,
in the story you tell.
mm. In The Mountain Sing, Grandma Diệu Lan said this to herself: when humans fail us, nature can rescue us. And
Uh-huh.
in the book, I also include the practice of traditional medicine, where Dr. Ngọc uses traditional medicines to heal the soldiers during the war because she didn't have access to Western medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have been using, like traditional or herbal medicines for thousands of years. And I think there is so much healing and beauty and power from nature and energy from nature. And I feel so much pain seeing how we destroy nature from our acts of wars, of violence, or from our greed. We destroy parks and forests and jungles to build all of these hotels or industrial zones. And I think for me, as a citizen of a country, I want to see balanced development, sustainable development where we protect our environment, protect nature, because I feel we cannot have a happy and peaceful life unless we respect Mother Nature and we live
Mm-hmm.
in harmony with the environment. And like the destruction that is caused on nature, on the environment, is one great consequence of war that we haven't talked enough about. I have written on the New York Times an article about Agent Orange, the impact of Agent Orange
Yes.
on Vietnamese women and the environment, because I grew up, eating fish which was disfigured, and the neighbors were telling don't eat it because like there was a lot of chemicals sprayed onto our land, our waters, our ponds. Don't eat it. But we were too poor, so we were eating, disfigured fish when I was growing up. So, in a way I was eating the war, so I
Mm.
remember when I gave birth to my kids, one of the first things I look was at their fingers and toes. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
I was
Mm-hmm.
praying that they would be whole because
Yes.
I was volunteering, working with the victims of Agent Orange. And the sad reality for me is that like in Vietnam, there are still areas which are still very much infected,
Yes.
by Agent Orange, and there haven't been, enough, there haven't been enough actions to clean up, and yet we move on with all the wars. And I really think, human beings everywhere on earth, we are related. We are children of Mother Earth. We need to find ways to live with each other in harmony, respect each other for our differences, and know how to work with each other and resolve our conflicts without using violence, without using weapons. Because, I think one day the human race would make ourselves extinct the way that we
Well, we
are.
all sometimes worry about that, don't we?
Yeah, and I see it
Yes.
coming.
Yes. Yes. So, you're very interesting, Quimai, to hear you talk about your perspective on writing in English for an audience, the Western audience, to present a story in a book that is about the Vietnamese people and written from the Vietnamese perspective, as you described. And it sounds like, to a large degree, in your upcoming book, Dust Child, as well. Are you continuing to write in both Vietnamese and English between, your literature and your poetry?
For sure, I write in both languages, and I think it enriches me as a writer, because sometimes when I get stuck on a project, I switch to another project,
Oh, yeah.
And I think, for example, if I write a poem in both English and Vietnamese, sometimes I go back and I edit the other
Mm,
version. So I think writing in both languages, allow me to look into the layers of the language and discover, something really unique about each language, and somehow transfer the beauties of one language to another. For
mhm.
example, in when I write in Vietnamese language, I think a lot about images, a lot about rhythm. So I hope to transfer some of that into English. And I mean, I will never be able to write English in the way that a native English speaker can. So my English is like, it has a Vietnamese flavor almost.
Yes. Right.
But
Right.
I want to include, the Vietnamese language, the Vietnamese culture into my English, because I'm proud of my culture. And we have such rich literary traditions that I want to reflect in my writing in English. And I think writing in English helps me um, achieve another mission, which is to decolonize literature in English about Vietnam. For example, when you read The Mountain Sing, did you find it challenging, to have to remember the names of the characters?
Oh, very hard to keep track of everybody.
Very hard, right? But,
Yes.
but I think I respect your decision to try and show, to try and embrace our culture and our language,
Hmm.
because because normally when the Vietnamese language is published as part of the Western text, we are expected to remove all the diacritical marks,
Yes. Yes.
and these
You
marks
did not.
I did not.
Yes.
I told my publisher, I would rather sell less book than show disrespect to my language. Because
Hmm.
for hundreds of years, you know, we have been colonized. We have been colonized by the Mongolians, the Chinese, the French, the Japanese.
Hmm.
America tried to colonize us. So we have suffered so much loss to our language, and then I feel like the way that we have been expected to change our language, to remove the tonal marks, to make it
Hmm.
easy for the Western readers, is a way that we are colonized, because we need
Very interesting.
to change our language to
Yes.
please the eyes and ears of the Westerners. And
Yeah.
this is my way of saying, if you want to, I want to serve you a story with chili lemongrass, fish sauce with the authentic Vietnamese way. That way you can appreciate much more, the Vietnamese culture, the
Yes.
complexity, the richness, the color of Vietnam, and I think, if people dig deeper into the language, like the tonal marks are so important. For example, I
Hmm.
can give you an example, the one name in the book, Mrs. Tu,
Hmm.
her name means refined beauty. But if you remove the mark, Tu means to be a monk.
Hmm.
Uh,
Two very different things.
two very different things. So you need
Yes.
the mark for the
Yes.
word to have, the beauty and the meaning of it. So when you remove the mark, for example, a part of my name, Quế Mai, my
Yes.
name is Quế Mai. So the word QUE has a mark, like a
Hmm.
head and an up mark. So Quế means cinnamon. So this is a part of my name. Quế
Hmm.
means cinnamon, because my parents named myself and my two brothers ingredients of the Vietnamese herbal medicine, so that
Oh,
we
wow.
so that
Okay.
we could stay healthy, right? So yeah, so if I am to write my name in the Western standard, I would have to
Yes.
remove the mark. So without the head and the sack, my name would be like QUE. So que means a stick.
A
So
stick.
yeah,
Yes.
so from cinnamon, I would
Yes.
become a stick.
Right.
And
Right.
like the word QUE can be written like que means invalid or disabled, or que means countryside. So these tonal marks are so important, like roofs of a home. So that
But it also ties, it reminds me of what you said earlier about the importance of imagery in Vietnamese language and the meaning behind the word, right?
exactly. And I mean, all Vietnamese names and street names and city names all have special meanings. So when you remove the marks, you strip away the meanings of these
Yes.
beautiful
That's so
words.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kim, I so grateful that you have taken us sort of into the book, but also sort of behind the book and the inspiration and the motivations. And I so look forward to the next month when Death Child is released and reading it and hopefully finishing it before my daughter does this time. And to all of our listeners, I hope our conversation will have inspired you to go and read The Mountain Sing. It is a poignant, emotional, lovely book about a period in Vietnam that is, filled with sorrow, but also with love and strength. And I'm grateful that you've spent the number of years, Quế Mai, that you did to produce a book that you have shared not just with the people of Vietnam, but having written it in English, the audience here in the United States. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rexon, for the honor of this conversation. It felt like speaking with a friend, and and I'm very excited to be embarking on my international book tour very, very soon for Das Chai. So I'm preparing a lot of special performances, including a Vietnamese opera song that I composed myself that I'm going to
Oh,
sing.
wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I hope to meet many of your listeners during my book tour.
Sounds fantastic. To our listeners, thank you again. Please be sure to rate and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time on Tea Leaves.